What would you do if your boss called you a slave in front of everyone? For Jamal Bennett, that moment wasn't just an insult. It was a turning point, a spark that would ignite something far greater than he ever imagined, something that would shake the foundations of his workplace and ripple far beyond. Morning light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sleek, open-plan office in Dallas, Texas. The quiet hum of keyboards filled the air, punctuated by soft laughter as coworkers exchanged small talk over coffee. Another Monday, another day in a cycle that felt as unrelenting as it was predictable. For Jamal Bennett, however, nothing about today felt routine. Every morning felt like a battle he hadn't signed up for, yet one he couldn't afford to lose. At 34, Jamal was a man of quiet determination, always dressed in crisp suits that spoke to his discipline and ambition. He had spent the last 5 years at Austin and Reed, working relentlessly, believing in the power of hard work, improving himself. It wasn't just a job to him, it was a chance to break barriers that had held his family back for generations. But lately, that belief was starting to crack under the weight of something heavier, the unspoken tension, the quiet but unmistakable hostility. And at the center of it all, Meredith Cole. To most, Meredith was a sharp, no-nonsense leader. She had risen quickly through the ranks, her ambition undeniable. Some saw her as a symbol of perseverance, but to Jamal, she was the force pressing him down. It had started small, disregarding his ideas in meetings, speaking over him, nitpicking his work while letting others slide. She never raised her voice, never made outright accusations, but the message was clear: you don't belong here. Each interaction felt like walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from a fall that would cost him everything. That morning, Jamal walked into the office gripping his coffee mug, steadying himself for another day under Meredith's watchful, condescending eye. He had a big presentation ahead, one he had poured weeks of effort into, refining every detail, making sure it was flawless. But when he reached his desk, his stomach twisted. His slides had been altered. The carefully crafted analysis, the depth of research, it was gone, stripped down to shallow bullet points that barely scratched the surface of his work. And at the bottom, stamped in cold finality, were Meredith's initials. A slow, simmering frustration built inside him. This wasn't the first time she had taken credit for his work, and he knew that confronting her outright would only make things worse. But something about today felt different. He couldn't let this slide. Not this time. "Good morning, Jamal." Her voice cut through the air like a blade. Meredith stood at his desk, arms crossed, lips curled into a smirk that never reached her eyes. "I made a few changes to your slides. They were a little complicated." Jamal looked up, meeting her gaze with a calm he didn't fully feel. "I see that," he said, keeping his tone even. "A heads up would have been appreciated before making those changes." For a fraction of a second, her smirk faltered. Then just as quickly it sharpened. "Well," she said lightly, "that's why I'm the manager. I know what works for our clients." The jab was subtle, but it landed. Jamal clenched his jaw but didn't respond. Arguing here, in front of everyone, would only feed into whatever narrative she was crafting about him. But something deep inside him told him that today, something was going to shift, and he had no idea just how far it would go. The hours crawled by, tension gnawing at him as he prepared to present. By the time the team gathered in the conference room, the air was thick with anticipation. Jamal had rehearsed every word of his presentation, determined to make the best of the butchered slides. He would not let her sabotage define his work. Meredith leaned against the doorway, cup of tea in hand, an air of effortless superiority radiating from her. As the room settled, she clapped her hands sharply. "Let's get started. Jamal, the floor is yours," she said, her tone clipped, dismissive. Jamal took a steadying breath. And then he began. Even with the stripped-down slides, he commanded the room. His voice was steady, weaving in the details Meredith had erased, making up for what she had taken. His co-workers nodded along, engaged, impressed. But from across the room, Meredith's eyes burned into him. She interrupted twice, questioning points she knew were solid. It wasn't about clarity. It was about control, about undermining him, forcing him to second-guess himself in front of their peers. He refused to let her. He adapted, pressed forward, and when he finished, the room erupted into applause. "That was really insightful," one of his colleagues, Noah, spoke up. "Great job, Jamal." A flicker of something dark passed over Meredith's face. She smiled, but it was thin, brittle. "Yes, well, it seems Jamal had some help with this," she said smoothly, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "A true team effort." The words cut, sharp and calculated. The sting was real, but Jamal kept his face neutral. The meeting ended. People began to file out. But as he turned to leave, Meredith's voice stopped him cold. "A word, in my office." The moment was coming. He could feel it. And this time, he wasn't backing down. The moment that changed everything. Meredith's words still hung in the air, thick with venom, lingering like the aftermath of a storm. Jamal stood in her office, refusing to take the seat she gestured toward. The space was as cold and sterile as the woman who occupied it. Walls lined with plaques of her achievements, shelves meticulously arranged, not a single thing out of place. Yet the atmosphere felt suffocating, oppressive. Meredith leaned forward, her expression tight with barely concealed irritation. "Let's cut to the chase," she said, her voice clipped, laced with an authority she wielded like a weapon. "You've been towing a dangerous line, and I think it's time I remind you exactly who's in charge." Jamal's pulse quickened, but he remained still, waiting, watching. "The way you handled that presentation today?" She let out a slow, measured breath, shaking her head. "That was borderline insubordination." His eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "Insubordination?" His voice was calm, measured, but inside something was shifting. "For doing my job? For delivering a presentation effectively?" Her eyes narrowed. "For going beyond what was necessary," she snapped. "You made me look incompetent in front of the team." The accusation struck him like an unexpected blow. Jamal blinked, barely able to process the sheer audacity of her words. "With all due respect, Meredith, I simply wanted to present the full scope of my work," he said, his voice steady despite the tension curling in his chest. She leaned forward then, her expression sharp, her next words slicing through the room like a blade. "Don't forget your place here, Jamal." The air in the office shifted. "You're not the decision maker. You do the work you're assigned and leave the thinking to people like me." For a moment, silence filled the space between them, but inside Jamal, something snapped. A deep, resounding crack. He straightened his spine, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" His voice was calm, dangerously calm, but laced with something unshakable. Meredith didn't flinch. "You know exactly what I mean," she said, her voice dipping into a quiet, almost sinister whisper. "You're here to follow orders, not to play hero. Or have you forgotten where you come from?" The words, spoken so effortlessly, so cruelly, landed with the force of a punch. Jamal felt the heat rise in his chest, his hands clenching at his sides. Every muscle in his body tensed, his heart pounding against his ribs. And then she said it, the words that would change everything. "You're nothing more than a glorified slave in this office." It hit like a thunderclap. The air left his lungs. His vision tunneled for a split second. 1,000 thoughts surged at once. Memories of his father's words, his grandfather's sacrifices, his great-grandfather's struggle. The generations who had fought for dignity, for equality, for a world where a man like him wouldn't have to stand in an office like this and hear words like that. Jamal closed his eyes for half a second, steadying himself. He would not let anger dictate his next move. This moment demanded something greater. He took a slow, deliberate breath before stepping forward. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but filled with a power that made the very air in the room feel heavier. "Meredith," he said, each syllable deliberate, unwavering. "What you just said is not only offensive, it's unacceptable. And I refuse to stand here and let you degrade me or anyone else like that." For the first time, something flickered in her expression, a hint of unease. "You're being dramatic," she scoffed, though her voice lacked the firm conviction it usually carried. Jamal shook his head. "No," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'm being honest. And let me tell you something." He stepped closer to her desk, standing taller, his presence commanding the room. "My great-grandfather worked himself to the bone as a sharecropper in Mississippi. He picked cotton under a scorching sun for wages that barely put food on the table, but he never stopped dreaming of something better for his family. He could feel the weight of history pressing against his back, the voices of the past rising within him. My grandfather marched in Selma, fought for the right to vote, stood on the front lines of history, believing, knowing that equality was worth any price. My father? He spent his life reminding me that no matter how much the world tries to tear you down, you push forward, because your worth isn't defined by someone else's prejudice." The room was so quiet he could hear the faint murmur of conversations outside. Jamal's voice grew steadier, stronger. "I have worked for everything I have," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've worked harder than you could ever imagine to be where I am today. And no matter how much you try to diminish me, you cannot take that away." Meredith opened her mouth to respond, but Jamal lifted a hand. "No." His voice was resolute. "You've had your say. Now it's my turn." He turned slightly, glancing out the office window at the world beyond. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it is?" he asked, his voice quieter now, yet no less powerful. "To walk into a place every single day knowing that you're not judged by your work ethic or your skills, but by the color of your skin? To carry the weight of assumptions, expectations, stereotypes everywhere you go?" He turned back to face her. "And still, I show up." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I show up because I refuse to let people like you write my story." Meredith was silent now, her lips pressed together, her expression unreadable. Jamal took another step forward, lowering his voice to something almost intimate, yet unshakable. "What you said today wasn't just wrong. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that this company needs to address. Because if this is the culture you're fostering here, then it's time for a change." A sound from the doorway made them both turn. The office door had been left slightly ajar, and standing just outside was a small group of employees, his colleagues, watching in a stunned silence. Among them, Noah stepped forward, his voice trembling but firm. "Jamal," he said, his eyes filled with something close to admiration. "That was incredible. And you're right. This has gone on for too long." One by one, the others nodded, their expressions a mixture of shock, discomfort, and something else, understanding. Meredith's face was pale now, her posture rigid. She had underestimated him. She had thought she could say what she wanted, do what she wanted, and that it would end there. But now, she had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Jamal inhaled deeply, his hands still trembling slightly as he stepped past them, walking back to his desk. The office was silent, but the shift had already begun. A reckoning was coming, and Jamal Bennett would not be silenced. A reckoning and a new beginning. Jamal had spoken the truth that had weighed on him for far too long, but even as he walked back to his desk, A lingering question gnawed at the edges of his mind. What happens now? Would the company pretend this had never happened, brushing it under the rug as so many corporations did when faced with uncomfortable truths? Or would they finally confront the deep-seated issues that had been allowed to fester unchecked for years? His answer arrived that same afternoon. At precisely 1:42 p.m., an email from Human Resources landed in every employee's inbox. The subject line was stark, leaving no room for ambiguity. Immediate meeting, workplace conduct. Jamal's stomach tensed as he clicked the message open. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. Attendance was mandatory. As the hour approached, the air in the office grew thick with tension. People whispered in hushed tones, their gazes flickering toward Jamal with a mixture of curiosity and quiet admiration. By the time he stepped into the conference room, it was already packed, every chair occupied, with a few employees standing along the walls. At the head of the long table sat Meredith. She was noticeably different now. Her usual poised confidence had been stripped away, replaced by a rigid discomfort. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her jaw set in an expression that teetered between anger and unease. At the front of the room stood Olivia Cruz, the Director of Human Resources, a woman known for her composure, for her ability to navigate difficult conversations without so much as a crack in her demeanor. But today, Olivia wasted no time with the usual pleasantries. Her voice was measured, but there was no mistaking the gravity in her tone. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began. "As some of you may already be aware, an incident occurred earlier today that has forced us to confront some serious concerns about our workplace culture. We are here to address those concerns. Now." The room was deathly silent. Her gaze moved steadily across the employees before settling on Jamal. "First, I want to acknowledge Jamal for his courage in speaking up. It takes immense strength to stand against injustice, especially in an environment where silence has often been the easier choice." Meredith shifted uncomfortably, but she said nothing. "What happened today," Olivia continued, "is unacceptable. Let me be absolutely clear. Alton and Reed has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and harassment of any kind. As of this moment, an internal investigation has been launched, and appropriate actions will be taken." Her words settled over the room like a heavy weight, pressing into every unspoken fear, every buried grievance that had long been ignored. For the first time since stepping into that office, Jamal felt something stir deep within him, a flicker of hope, not just for himself, for everyone who had suffered in silence. When the meeting ended, something unexpected happened. One by one, his co-workers approached him, not with the empty, performative sympathy he had so often encountered in the past, but with real sincerity. Noah was the first. "Jamal." His voice was thick with emotion, his eyes brimming with something that looked a lot like guilt. "I should have spoken up sooner. I saw the way she treated you, and I said nothing. That's on me." Jamal met his gaze, nodding slowly. "We all have a responsibility to speak up," he said, "not just when it's easy, but when it's necessary." Another coworker, Kevin, stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "Man, I don't even know what to say," he admitted. "But what you did today, you stood up for all of us, whether we realized it or not." Jamal accepted their words with grace, but he made one thing crystal clear. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice firm. "This is about making sure no one else has to go through this again. And if we want real change, then it has to start with all of us." The next few days were a whirlwind. Meredith was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, and the whispers about her behavior turned into full-blown revelations. Stories surfaced, stories of mistreatment, of belittlement, of careers stunted under the weight of her unchecked authority. People who had once been too afraid to speak now found the courage to share their experiences. But Jamal didn't revel in the fallout. This was never about revenge. This was about change. And change was finally beginning to take root. Over the following weeks, a transformation swept through Alton and Reed. Difficult conversations, ones that had long been avoided, were finally being held. Human Resources launched a company-wide initiative to confront workplace bias. Outside consultants were brought in to lead training sessions, facilitating discussions on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Jamal became an unlikely leader in the movement. His presence at company meetings now carried a newfound respect, and employees began seeking him out, not just to commend him, but to ask for guidance, for advice. He wasn't just the man who stood up to Meredith anymore. He had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, one voice could make a difference. Then one afternoon, Olivia Cruz approached him with a proposal. "We're launching a diversity council," she said, "and we think you would be the perfect person to lead it." Jamal felt the weight of her words settle over him. It was a huge responsibility, a chance to truly reshape the company from the inside out. But as he looked around the office, the faces of his co-workers, some hopeful, some still hesitant, he knew there was only one answer he could give. "I'd be honored," he said, "but this can't just be about me. This has to be about all of us. Everyone in this company needs to feel like they matter." And so the first meeting of the Diversity Council was held. Employees shared their stories, some painful, some inspiring. Together they worked to develop strategies to ensure fair hiring practices, equal opportunities for advancement, and most importantly, a culture where everyone felt valued. Outside the office, the incident had sparked an even bigger conversation. Jamal was invited to speak at community events, sharing his experience and encouraging others to find their voices. His message was simple but powerful. Change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we speak out, even when it's hard. As time passed, Alton and Reed became something unexpected. An example, a case study in what happens when people refuse to accept the status quo. Through open dialogue, real accountability, and meaningful reforms, the company began the slow process of rebuilding trust, and all because one person had refused to be silent. Jamal had never sought to be a hero. He was just a man who had spoken the truth. But in doing so, he had ignited something far greater than himself. And while the journey toward justice was far from over, one thing was certain. The seeds of change had been planted, and they would never be uprooted again.